All right, well, it's 2 after, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It's great to see such a good group of folks joining us. My name is Ann Blair. I'm Vice President of Policy and Freight at the Electrification Coalition. For those who haven't been on one of our webinars or part of one of our events in the past, the Electrification Coalition is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization that develops and implements a broad set of strategies to facilitate the widespread adoption of transportation electrification. And we're focused on transportation electrification for the economic, public health, and national security benefits and how we can overcome the challenges of America's dependence on oil. We are excited today to host this webinar on a new report that we just released called Electrifying the Future of Freight, Strategies to Accelerate Medium and Heavy-Duty Charging Infrastructure Deployment. To set the stage for our work, wanted to just share this snapshot of where the Electrification Coalition works. We do work across the country and focus on specific policy programs in specific states. As you can see here, we are engaged across the board nationally. And the red dots that you see here are some of the city and local focus programs that we're also engaged in. So if you are engaged in activities in any of these areas or beyond, please don't hesitate to reach out to us if we are not yet working with you all. So as I mentioned today, we are focused on a report that we recently released outlining the policy and utility reforms needed to overcome the challenge for policymakers and industry leaders to scale U.S. transportation electrification. It is a pivotal time in our economy for energy security and affordability. This report is one of a series of reports that we'll be releasing that will address specific market challenges and sharing actionable strategies to overcome those barriers and maximize on the opportunity that we have ahead. So, as we go from pilot to large-scale deployment, reliable charging infrastructure is critical, and is the primary barrier that we found in our report. And we're going to talk to a panel of experts that contributed to the report and discuss how we can work together to overcome those. To get started, I'd like to introduce Will Marshall. He's the EC's freight manager and really master of our team focused on freight electrification and education efforts. Will has been with the EC for 3 years or so, and prior to joining the EC, he was the senior legislative assistant at KDCR, a bipartisan lobbying firm, in which he worked on developing and advocating for federal policy and regulatory policies. He holds degrees from George Washington University and the University of Maryland, and just excited for Will to share more about what's in our report. Over to you, Will.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, and good afternoon and good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Like Ann said, my name is Will Marshall. I'm the Freight Program Manager with the EC, and I'm really excited to share the findings from our latest report on medium and heavy duty charging infrastructure. So in this report, we examined the major barriers slowing down the deployment of charging infrastructure for electric trucks, as well as the actions that are needed to overcome those barriers. Through conversations with fleets, charging site developers, utilities, policymakers, shippers, and other industry stakeholders, we looked at what's working, where challenges remain, and what it will take to scale the infrastructure moving forward nationwide. Really, one of the most important themes of this report is that despite the uncertainty and changing priorities at the federal level, meaningful progress is still happening and can continue to happen across the country. We are continuing to see strong momentum from states, local governments, utilities, ports, fleets, and private industry moving freight electrification forward. So through our stakeholder engagement and analysis, we identified 5 major barriers impacting deployment, along with 11 actionable solutions to address them. I also want to emphasize that these barriers and solutions are deeply interconnected. Freight electrification is ultimately a systems deployment challenge. Progress in one area can easily be slowed by bottlenecks somewhere else in the system. So while individual solutions are important, long-term success requires coordinated action across vehicles, charging infrastructure, utilities, permitting, policy, and many more. So the first barrier that we identified in our report is the high upfront costs of electric trucks, which can limit the adoption of these vehicles and in turn the charging demand utilization rates. For commercial charging developers and operators, utilization is critical. These companies need the confidence that enough trucks will be on the road and consistently using their sites before they can justify large infrastructure investments. So while this report focuses on infrastructure, one of the clearest messages we heard from stakeholders was that accelerating vehicle deployment and accelerating charging deployment must happen together. So some of the solutions that we highlight in the report, including vehicle purchase incentives, which many charging providers even describe as one of the most effective ways of increasing site utilization and getting those trucks on the road. Residual value guarantees and financing support mechanisms can help fleets reduce uncertainty around resale value, as well as improve access to capital. Competitive or clean fuel standards, which were repeatedly identified as a highly effective policy tool. In particular, stakeholders pointed to California's LCFS's fast charging infrastructure credit that effectively functions as a 20% utilization floor for public charging sites, creating that certainty for commercial charging developers in the near term. And finally, outside of direct policy work, but demand aggregation strategies, where multiple fleets or shippers can coordinate deployment of trucks and charging demand to help stabilize utilization and improve economic certainty. Since we spoke about incentives as a solution in the previous barrier, the second barrier that we heard is really when incentives and programs administered by government agencies or utilities have complex or prescriptive program design. Many stakeholders shared that incentive and funding programs can often be difficult to navigate or too rigid to reflect real-world fleet operations are burdened with extensive and fragmented reporting requirements. These challenges can be especially difficult for smaller fleets and businesses that may not have that dedicated staff focused on grant applications or compliance. In some cases, while programs are technically available, it can be practically inaccessible. To address this, the report recommends a more flexible performance-based program design, along with standardized reporting requirements and more consistent definitions across agencies as well as jurisdictions. Ultimately, these programs are doing a great job in getting the vehicles and infrastructure deployed, and they should be designed around enabling that deployment and measurable outcomes rather than overly prescriptive processes. The third barrier is on grid interconnection delays and uncertainty around available capacity. For many projects, interconnection timelines can stretch significantly beyond expectations. These delays can increase costs, create uncertainty for developers and fleets, and in some cases, determine whether or not a project can move forward at all. Stakeholders emphasize that this challenge is not only about the speed of interconnection, but also the level of transparency and predictability. Developers need this earlier visibility into available capacity, upgrade requirements, and broader timelines in order to make investment decisions. To address this report highlights the importance of proactive utility planning and investments, particularly in areas where freight electrification demand can be anticipated, taking into account the policies in that area, the level of freight activity, as well as broader market conditions. And as we found in our research, proactive investments can result in savings compared to a more reactive approach when it comes to freight electrification. We also recommend flexible service connection approaches to enable sites to get online earlier while additional capacity comes online. We'll hear about some of this in our guest presentations and Q&A, I'm sure. Even after interconnection challenges are addressed, project economics can still be influenced by electricity rate design, highlighting our fourth barrier. Many existing commercial electricity rate structures were not designed with medium and heavy-duty truck electrification charging in mind, particularly during the early stages when deployment of charging utilization rates are still relatively low. Stakeholders noted that high demand charges or inflexible rate structures can make operating charging sites financially challenging, even when the underlying technology and business case are otherwise strong. The report outlines the need for rate structures that better align with freight charging operations while still supporting overall grid reliability and peak demand management. Time of use rates, managed charging strategies, and other innovative rate approaches were identified to help create a more sustainable operating environment for both fleets as well as charging providers. The fifth and final barrier we identified is the fragmented and opaque local permitting processes. Different zoning requirements, permitting timelines, and review processes across jurisdictions can create uncertainty and slow deployment, especially for those fleets and charging developers who are operating across multiple jurisdictions and regions. The report recommends harmonizing permitting processes where possible, highlighting examples where that is happening at the state level, as well as designating EV charging as a permitted use within relevant zoning categories, particularly in advance of charging infrastructure sites coming online. Even relatively small improvements in permitting consistency and transparency can significantly reduce deployment timelines and project risk. So in addition to examining the barriers and the solutions nationally, the report also explores how Southern California has emerged as a leading market for medium and heavy-duty charging deployment in the U.S. The region provides an important case study in how coordinated policy, utility planning, concentrated freight activity, as well as private sector investment can work together to accelerate deployment. We looked at specifically the role of the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, state incentive programs, utility engagement, as well as regional freight demand, and how that can create the conditions for early large-scale deployment. The map here is a screenshot from the Electrification Coalition's electric freight dashboard, illustrating the relationship between major freight facilities, freight corridors, and existing or planned medium and heavy-duty charging infrastructure sites. The data combines information from the National Zero Emission Freight Corridor Strategy, the Alternative Fuel Data Center's research, as well as supplemental research conducted by Atlas Public Policy, our partner in this tool and resource. Our analysis has also identified 7 notable medium and heavy-duty charging sites that have opened in this region since the beginning of 2025. Once fully built out, these sites will collectively represent approximately 54 megawatts of additional charging capacity, supporting freight electrification in the region with more projects in the pipeline. Shortly, we'll hear directly from Greenlane, one of those charging developers, helping lead this deployment effort in the area. Their experience provides really helpful and valuable real-world perspective in how to bring these sites online. Additionally, our team identified more than 20 incentive and grant programs targeting both the vehicle and infrastructure side that have been made available by state agencies like the California Air Resources Board, the California Energy Commission, the Department of Transportation, as well as the local air quality management districts, the ports of LA and Long Beach, and the utilities in the region. And this report doesn't even include the $1 billion Clean Fuel Reward Program that just opened yesterday, offering rebates for the purchase of electric medium and heavy duty trucks, funded by the state's low carbon fuel standard program. Ultimately, this report is intended to serve as a roadmap for policymakers, utilities, fleets, charging developers, and other industry partners looking to move beyond pilot projects and towards scalable, reliable charging infrastructure to support the deployment of electric trucks. With that, I will pass it back to Anne to introduce our guest speakers and those who helped contribute to our insights for this report. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Will. And there's already good chatter, about the California program and the funding that was just released this week as a result of the low carbon fuel standard in California. So glad to see that chatter, and I think it is a huge opportunity. Now I'm excited to introduce our panelists to talk more about the opportunities and how we make this more of a reality elsewhere and share a little bit more about the details of each of the projects. So we are going to have Matthew Wiggins, he's policy manager at Green Lane, John Burden, chief commercial officer at Navoya, Matt Lerman, senior infrastructure program manager at the Colorado Energy Office, and Eric Carlin, principal of clean transportation policy at PG&E. To get us kicked off, I'm going to pass it over to Matthew Wiggins to share a little bit more about what Green Lane is doing.
Thanks, Ann. Thanks, Will. Green Lane's really excited to have collaborated with the EC on this report. And I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Green Lane and what we've been up to and kind of what we're looking to for the future, and then talk a little bit about some of the lessons that we had that were included in EC's case study here. So let's go to the next slide, please. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Green Lane is a joint venture of Daimler Truck North America, NextEra Energy, and BlackRock. And our goal really is to build a nationwide network of corridor-connected, high-power commercial EV charging sites for medium and heavy-duty vehicles. Our first site is in Southern California, and we have plans to expand throughout the Southwest. And we recently announced our expansion plans into Texas, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But Green Lane's differentiated in the market because we operate a fully public business model. So anyone can drive into a Green Lane facility and tap a credit card and charge. It really is kind of the electrified truck stop of the future. Let's go to the next slide, please. So Green Lane is kind of uniquely situated in the market in that because of our corridor strategy, we're really able to capture multiple duty cycles. And as truck technology gets to be improved and we're seeing new products on the market that can go further and charge faster, we're really prepared and positioned to be able to enable not just those short haul warehouse drayage operations, but start to get into regional haul and even long haul operations. We've had testing done from our facility in the Inland Empire that's taken trucks all the way into Texas. And we're excited to kind of illuminate that I-10 corridor and then I-5 north so that we can help our customers to take freight further on zero emission platforms. We're also designing our sites so that they are ready for kind of the future of freight. A lot of customers are looking at regional haul and seeing that things like slip seating and dropping trailers and sending drivers back home every night is something that's working really well for them. We're also planning to only install megawatt charging systems moving forward. So we will be ready for the trucks that have the highest charging capability so that we can get them back on the road as soon as possible. That being said, we've also got sites coming online in the Port of Long Beach later this year to make sure that we can serve the drayage market. And we'll also be opening a site in Blythe, California to continue our expansion along I-10. Let's go next slide, please. So a little bit more about our facility in Colton, and this is the facility that was profiled in the EC report here. We opened this facility a little more than a year ago. Colton is near San Bernardino in the Inland Empire of Southern California, and our facility in Colton has around 50 high-power chargers. There's some details on the slide here. We actually have to update that. We've upgraded our CCS chargers, so they're now 240 kilowatts. But the entire facility was designed with upgradability and future technology in mind. So we're ready to upgrade this site to megawatt charging as soon as customers are ready with trucks that will support that. And we are operating this site with a reservation-based system. So we're a very technology-forward company. The partners that we work with in the freight space are able to reserve our lanes so that they have guaranteed charging whenever they're rolling in, so they know that there will be a space available for them. But we're also fully public, so there will be spaces available for folks who need to drive in and charge as well. We're designed around these pull-through lanes, so we wanted to enable freight with trailers so that you don't have to drop that in order to charge. The facility, as you can see from that photo on the left, is wide open, lots of space to be able to maneuver with trucks. What's really interesting about the Colton Center and what we talk about in the report is just how quickly we were able to bring this site online with collaboration from the local utility, the city, and other partners in the area. We went from groundbreaking to energization in just about 9 months, and that was no small feat, and it was due to a lot of hard work and support from, like I said, the city, the mayor, the city council. But this is also located in the territory of a municipal utility, Colton Electric Utility. And they were really able to get us online quick. We're phasing in power over time as it's becoming available. So we're able to kind of grow as they're able to offer us more power. This is also a really strategic location for us. It's right at the intersection of the 10 and 215 freeways. If you've ever been in this part of Southern California, you know just how much freight is moving down the freeway here. There's also co-located rail yards that are taking freight from the ports. So we viewed this as a great kind of jumping off point for a lot of freight that's moving throughout the Southwest. Let's go to the next slide, please. So here's a kind of map that details some of our expansion plans in the near future. I will say, if you were able to join us at ACT Expo, you saw some more detailed plans that are actually reflected here. We'll talk a little bit more during the Q&A about our recently announced expansion into Texas. We're planning to open sites in Dallas and Houston to enable some freight alongside our partner, Navoya. So this is kind of what's planned in the immediate, and we're hoping to be able to share more in the future. I think that those are all the slides that I have. Happy to turn it back over to EC so that we can continue moving. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Matthew. Really exciting to see the progress that you all have made. Next, we're going to shift to hearing from the trucks, from the carriers. So I'm going to pass it to JV to share a little bit about what Navoya is doing and how their engagement in the market is critical.
Awesome. Well, it's nice to hear Matt talking about Greenlane's work as well. So I think it's clear from the announcement last week at the ACT Expo, but generally speaking, the partnership we have with Greenlane, incredibly excited to work with somebody who knows the ins and outs of how to build infrastructure in the right spots. And that really sets the stage for a carrier like Navoya to be able to deploy our services. Awesome. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so I think a quick refresh here in terms of opportunity, and that'll give me a sense of positioning Navoya within the space. So Navoya at our core, we are a fully electric truckload carrier. And so our role is to ensure that goods move from point A to point B. It just so happens that we're doing so with heavy duty battery electric trucks. And so I think what I would draw attention to here is that historically, we're operating in a very large market, which has a lot of fragmentation. And so the largest player in the space has around 1% of the market ownership. And what you've historically seen is that given that fragmentation on the carrier side, carriers have typically found it quite challenging and almost adversarial in terms of the ways in which they can work with shippers. Our belief is that the market is at a really interesting inflection point where there are these three forces converging, one of which is the EV piece, but you have the EVs, the AI component, and the autonomy piece all coming together at a time where you will be able to capture and deliver meaningful value as a carrier to shippers in a way in which it lets you expand your network dramatically. And so from our perspective, focusing on battery electric trucks as the core part of our build out enables us to demonstrate that value to shippers early on. Next slide, please. All right, okay, so here is a little bit more around how we think about ourselves as a new kind of trucking company. And so I think first call out here is like very much remiss of me not to acknowledge that as things stand, we do operate within this world of constraints. So the trucks are more expensive, the battery range has so far been limited, and the charging infrastructure isn't yet prevalent over all aspects of the market. The industry historically has been, and it is easy to be quite pessimistic and cynical about these realities. But I think one of the strengths that we've had as an organization is to really think about how do you operate within the world of those constraints? And then as they remove themselves over time, as the Tesla Semi, for example, comes into market at a cheaper price point, at a battery range and performance perspective that is better than what has existed in the space, and as the likes of Greenlanes and others deploy the charging infrastructure in markets, you can get to a place where you can serve a broader segment of the freight needs in the market. One thing I will mention here is like our focus on the electrification side is really critical for a variety of reasons. And I think the fundamental piece that I try to articulate in conversations like this is that it is very challenging to bolt on EVs to an existing diesel operating logic. And so the electric powertrain piece fundamentally changes the cost structure of trucking, right? In a world with diesel assets, you are optimizing for revenue per mile. In a world with battery electric assets, you're focused on optimizing for this time-based utilization. And the rationale here is that when you have an asset cost, i.e. a fixed cost that's dominating, it completely inverts how you think about the planning, the dispatch, the pricing, all of those pieces. And the lower energy costs you can access via the battery electric platform and the reduced maintenance pieces ensure that you can have this marginal cost relative to diesel being substantially lighter. And so therefore, like when you are running these assets, you're running them and incentivized to maximize utilization. And the reason I share that is like in order to think through how do you go about running that operation, we've had to internally develop an EV and AI native transportation management system that is very much built for the unique constraints of electric trucks. So we're capturing and modeling these specific parameters on the range side of things, the charging speed, the energy cost, the degradation, all data points that transportation management systems, TMSs, historically haven't natively supported. And so for us, that's been a hugely important component of ensuring that we use the right technology. And I use that terms in terms of the hardware, the battery electric trucks, but also the software that we're creating for the running of our operation to determine what are the right kinds of loads that we want to be moving, what kind of network do we want to be developing, and ultimately, like, what are we learning about carrying those different types of freights for different customers in order to get to those high levels of utilization. Final piece I'll mention here is that we are building in an age of technology where we've been able to leverage AI to sort of drive workflow automation and efficiency across our business. So you have sort of the efficiency of how you think about optimizing the truck asset, but also this ability to say, can we build out a team that is more effective and impactful? And so you look at traditional trucking carriers and they're spending something of the order of 25 to 35% of their revenue on back office overhead. And our approach has very much been to think about where are those useful opportunities to deploy AI agents across dispatch, exception management, billing, customer communication, all things that let us grow our business without growing our cost basis. And so thinking then about how do we deliver that level of experience and customer satisfaction where the resources have been freed up on our team to spend that disproportionate amount of time with customers, figuring out how do you problem solve, how do you expand your network together. Next slide, please. We can actually skip past that, kind of like a bit duplicative on that one. So let's skip past that piece as well. So I think traction is pretty important. So we've been running now for about 15, 16 months. We have and are serving around 15 plus Fortune 500 companies. We've established ourselves as a leader in the book and claim segment. And I know there'll be a couple of questions in the Q&A talking about that. And then I think we have expanded our operation pretty dramatically. So California was a very clear and obvious place for us to launch. And we've done a really excellent job of building credibility and reputation with customers in that market. But what we're seeing is that being able to prove out that operational value day to day, whether it's the drayage work we're doing, whether it's the work in the Inland Empire supported by Greenlane's Colton site, whether it's some of the longer lengths of haul along the I-5 or 99 up to Northern California, or taking advantage of the Blythe sites with the Greenlane folks heading out on the I-10, we're landing and expanding with customers by virtue of demonstrating what is possible today. And so I often talk about this notion of having that level of consistency is the thing that drives momentum for us, has been an incredible way in which we can think about removing and sort of moving beyond those constraints that exist and that I mentioned up front, serving customers on lanes where it makes sense to do so today. And then as the new vehicle technology comes online with the Tesla semi-production coming into action, being able to support a broader proportion of customers' networks as time develops. Next slide, please. And onto the interesting stuff here. So the infrastructure piece. So I think a couple of call outs here from me would be two really important variables when you think about the cost competitiveness of electric trucking are going to be the daily mileage that you can run and your cost per kilowatt hour. So you need to have charging that is sensibly priced in the right locations. And so as an industry, it's upon us, and as an operator within the industry, it's upon us to figure out how do we find the right kinds of partners and the right kinds of structures that let us put ourselves in a place where we can serve the freight demand that is there. And so whether that's working with a leader in the space to consolidate electricity procurement to capture those lower blended rates by virtue of some owned and operated charging infrastructure, but also working with folks on shared opportunities. That is the critical piece. Is like this is going to take the industry to come together, figure out in which markets does this make sense, what do we need to have in place in terms of creative solutions to let us launch into the market. And so from our perspective, demand aggregation on the book and claim side has proved to be a really innovative way in which we can have the confidence to enter a market at scale. And because the cost per mile does exhibit this high sensitivity to loaded electricity costs, our ability to modestly reduce the per kilowatt hour rate creates this outsized improvement in competitiveness that lets us drive the virtuous cycle of being able to deploy more and more trucks on that lane. And so you need to work with these key partners to unlock some negotiating power, whether it's with the OEMs, whether it's with the utilities, whether it's deploying a certain number of trucks to make this viable in a market. And as I mentioned, that shared infrastructure investment just reduces the capital intensity per truck while really accelerating the deployment timelines. I think battery electric transitions are often talked about in sort of long-term time horizons. And I think what is really important for us is to demonstrate the value today to all of the stakeholders to continue to drive that momentum. And a last piece from me here would be around the importance of acting fast. Like strong belief on our side that the infrastructure advantages are going to intensify over time. And I speak about that from the perspective of an operator in the space, which is there are significant network density effects. And so my utilization rates can improve exponentially with that network density. The more trucks I can deploy using that shared charging mean higher asset productivity, lower per unit costs, and that self-reinforcing cycle is vastly advantageous for us as a carrier in the space. But would argue that our ability to anchor into a new market opens up an opportunity for our quote unquote competitors in the space. And so figuring out and making sure that we are building in public, leading by example, affords us as an industry the ability to dramatically expand. And then the other component here is like strategic location control. There are limited high quality charging sites and oftentimes pretty significant barriers to entry in these markets, whether it's on the permitting side, the utility connection, the land acquisition. And so working with partners who can act quickly, secure those optimal locations across freight corridors, establishes a network for trucking carriers like Nevoya to deploy. I'll hit pause there, but excited to take some questions and continue the conversation.
Great. Thanks so much, JV. You really highlighted some of the important considerations and, your last slide discussing partnerships. And next, we're going to hear from utility on really where are we going to get our power and how are they thinking about deployment and engagement here. So pleased to introduce Eric Carlin from PG&E to share his perspective and the role that they play. So Eric.
Hey, thanks. And yeah, appreciate it and great to be here today. I'm Eric Carlin. I manage clean transportation policy at PG&E, and we really appreciate being featured in the report and being able to contribute to it. I'll start by just noting that really a lot has happened in the last 15 years of PG&E running programs and initiatives to support transportation electrification, the latter of which has featured programs specifically focused on medium and heavy duty. And overall, we've gotten to a point where I think 1 in 8 EVs in the entire country are in our service area, and in some counties, over 40% of new vehicle sales are EVs. And we've really transitioned from supporting the early adopters to the much more broader early majority. And for medium and heavy duty specifically, in 2024, nearly a quarter of all medium and heavy duty vehicle sales in California were zero emission. And it's really worth noting that none of that is a coincidence. It's the result of a combination of deliberate state policy and investment, and well over a decade of concerted utility investments and programs to help move the market and address market barriers. And in the face of some kind of recent headwinds, PG&E really does remain committed in supporting California and attaining its reaffirmed clean transportation goals. So we can flip to the next slide. I just have one placemat slide to kind of help guide the conversation here a little bit. And getting into some of the content in the report, with respect to upfront cost and program design barriers, we're currently in the midst of transitioning the bulk of our program portfolio from being ratepayer funded to being funded off bill with revenue from indeed California's low carbon fuel standard program, which is the earliest and largest example of that key solution identified in the report. This includes more standardized front of the meter tariff incentives and behind the meter incentives, which we've proposed in January specifically for commercial customers, which together are intended to backfill our sunsetting ratepayer funded programs and offerings for fleet customers and replace them with more streamlined options that are indeed more aligned with the strategies outlined in the report. Moving these programs from being funded off bill also further helps maximize the downward rate pressure benefit of this added load, and accelerate the customer affordability benefits that EVs bring to all customers, whether they drive an EV or not. Worth highlighting that, indeed, I think specific to medium and heavy duty and specific to PG&E service territory, there was a report that PACT and EEI put out this last week that included analysis from the firm E3 that showed that truck electrification specifically, by 2035 could cut residential rates for all customers by 4.5% or around $20 a year, and that's on top of the added benefit that light duty EVs bring to the grid and all customers. And this is critical because it directly affects and improves the economics for electrification, something that we're very focused on, and it addresses that fourth barrier in the report that I'll touch upon briefly in a moment. I'll also highlight that some of the more standardized tariff programs that we're standing up to support medium and heavy duty electrification. That includes our Rule 29 tariff, which provides significant project development support for to-the-meter costs. And that we've also proposed new tariffs for very large retail transmission connected projects, which will accelerate a process that previously was done via one-off contracts that our commission had to approve, and provide developers and ratepayers with assurances that assurances for this new added load and those related investments to bring them online. Both of these shifts utility support from a far less kind of prescriptive to a far less kind of complex market support mechanism, which is the solution identified in the report. And addressing the first barrier that the report highlights, I also just want to highlight, as others have, as far as also that I think it was announced just yesterday. We've been working on it for a while, but yeah, the California Clean Fuel Reward, which will provide $7,500 to $120,000 incentives for Class 2B through 8 ZEV trucks. That will be reopening on June 26th. This program was previously light duty focused, and we jointly run it with the other California utilities, and we fund it, in fact, with residential utility customer LCFS revenues. And this will make available $250 million this year and over $1 billion through 2030. And this is a really key strategy we're employing to help kind of backfill federal support for clean freight as the state kind of now focuses on carrots to help move the market. With respect to barrier 3, related to grid capacity energization, I think we're going to talk about this more a little bit later, but we've been working with our commission and stakeholders on evolving what was a pretty rigid process, not super well suited to rapidly increasing load, and changing customer needs to something that can better and more proactively plan and invest for the future, while better balancing the dual goals of having no stranded load and having no stranded assets, and ensuring that there's adequate funding to do that. We've also been leading with technology-enabled flexible service approaches and where there's grid constraints, as well as bridging solutions for customers. That's featured in the report. We're also evolving and standardizing a more analog load limit letter process for setting temporary seasonal limits to accelerate energization, which is an approach we've used for decades actually and gets far less attention. And finally here, I'll just highlight that rate design needs continue to evolve. We've seen some key approaches, and yeah, some of these key approaches and considerations are highlighted in the report, including the paramount priority for providing clear fuel cost savings and electricity for affordability, which transportation electrification itself can help with, as mentioned earlier. Also highlighted in the report are subscription or capacity-based rate designs, which is an approach that PG&E pioneered some years ago. Yeah, and while some use cases now might now prefer more traditional demand charge rates as their load factors and utilization have increased, it's still really important to provide rate options and recognize that the market is far from being homogeneous at this point. So yeah, with that, I'll wrap for now, and yeah, look forward to the subsequent discussion.
Great. Thanks so much, Eric. Really appreciate your perspective. So our final panelist for today that we're going to hear from is Matt Lerman from the Colorado Energy Office, that's really been a leader in implementing important programs for medium and heavy duty electrification. So welcome, Matt.
All right. Well, yeah, thanks, Ann, and thanks as well to the Electrification Coalition for the opportunity to contribute to this report and conversation. I think it's really cool that you guys have a distribution of panelists here from kind of each of the major sectors. Someone representing state agency on my side, utility side of the equation, a developer and charging operator, and a carrier. So I think it's a really good perspective. So just to introduce myself first, my name is Matt Lerman. I work as a senior infrastructure program manager on the transportation team at the Colorado Energy Office, and my role includes supporting kind of the ongoing management and evolution of the state's charging infrastructure incentive programs, as well as supporting policy, technical analysis, collaboration with utilities, and industry outreach and engagement. And specific to the focus of this conversation today on medium and heavy duty charging infrastructure, as part of my work, I led the development of Colorado's Fleet Zero grant program, which we initially launched in 2023, and where we offer ongoing statewide funding for fleet and medium and heavy duty EV charging. And we'll actually be reopening again in a couple of weeks on June 1st. And I also support Colorado's implementation of the clean truck strategy from the Energy Office side of the equation. So with that, if you could jump to the next slide, I'm going to give a brief presentation on a variety of different items. I won't speak to all of the bullets on the slides that I prepared, but my intention is really just to provide kind of like a 5,000-foot overview of the state of Colorado's overall efforts as it relates to medium and heavy duty electrification. And I do think these slides will be sent out afterwards. So if you are seeking more information, you can revisit those and kind of navigate the links. Otherwise, I'm happy to send those along. Generally, the way I like to categorize the work that the state's been doing flows in a manner that kind of first focuses on identifying the specific priorities and goals that the state's aiming to achieve, which then kind of flows on into planning, and that includes kind of guiding research and analysis to really help to identify what are the strategic actions that the state can take to work towards achieving those goals, and really clearly identifying what the associated costs are, what the benefits are, what are the key barriers and the prospective solutions, kind of a lot of what was done actually in this report. And then putting in place policy measures so we can address funding needs, industry support, industry certainty, as well as regulation as might be needed, and then ultimately developing and implementing programs that are supported by and guided by those planning and policy measures. And of course, aiming to ensure that there is that robust coordination, outreach, and engagement with key stakeholders. And to be a little bit more specific on the items in this slide and what that looks like in Colorado, we have specific tangible goals for the number of medium and heavy duty ZEVs on the road by 2030. We have medium and heavy duty ZEV sales targets, and then accelerated goals as well for our state fleet and for school and transit buses. We conducted an initial medium and heavy duty vehicle study in 2021 that directly informed then the specific goals that we identified, as well as specific near and midterm actions for the state to take and specific agency leads that were released in our state clean truck strategy in 2022. Following that, we conducted a medium and heavy duty charging infrastructure study and released an associated public GIS map that identified where, how much, and what required power and the associated costs would be needed to support the charging we need in the state to enable those 2030 goals, and then additional planning and efforts to seek funding through a CFI application that we unfortunately didn't receive funding for. But that has gone into now this analysis that's listed at the bottom of this slide that we are working on now, which ultimately is now kind of building on the analysis we did in 2023 to identify where exactly are the optimal locations and how should the state plan and time the investments to develop a shared truck charging network throughout the state. And of course, leading by example with ensuring that we can also support medium and heavy duty ZEV deployments by the state fleet. And if you could jump to the next slide. This next slide that I have here really kind of also touches on the other key items that I mentioned flowing from those priorities and planning measures, which is policy, programs, and coordination. So again, kind of not to specifically read through all of these different items, but I have these up there for reference for highlighting a few of the major policy efforts that we have implemented in the state, as well as a few of these specific programs and incentives that we have available. And that includes meaningful funding for medium and heavy duty charging infrastructure, as well as funding for medium and heavy duty trucks and technologies, tax incentives, stackable utility incentives from the state's IOUs. There are over 50 utilities in Colorado, so also being sure that we are, coordinating with our colleagues at our cooperative municipal utilities in the state who offer some varied offerings as well. And then lastly, but definitely not least, is I've just listed a few of our coordination and education and engagement efforts, which ranges kind of from a program that we offer through the Energy Office that provides free coaching for EVs and charging throughout the state. We have ongoing work groups and gatherings for Colorado's electric utilities. We have a broader Colorado Electric Vehicle Coalition, and then specific gatherings that we have coordinated to dig deeper and have in-person conversations both across agencies, with industry, with other key stakeholders, specifically on medium and heavy duty vehicle electrification. And that also includes our most recent coordination effort, which was what we called an Intermountain West Electric Freight Symposium that we co-hosted with NASIO at the National Lab of the Rockies here in Colorado in April, actually together with my fellow panelists, Matthew from Greenlane and JV from Navoya, who also graciously served on a panel at that event to discuss this topic. And then if we could just jump to the next slide, I've just got a couple last slides here just to quickly jump through and show kind of some of the visualizations of the results of the studies we've done. So this first kind of image on the right shows the top-down registration data that we overlaid in the first analysis to estimate charging needs throughout the state by county. We also have by utility territory and statewide. And then if you just give it a click as well, just kind of cycle through a different image here. Now we've kind of transitioned that analysis into really focusing on what the statewide medium and heavy duty truck charging hub network needs to look like. And if you give it another click, you can start to see how we're now building on that effort using data to identify exactly where the truck depots are throughout the state and the major origin destination locations. And you can see a zoom in on the left over there on that distribution in the metro area. And then if you give it another click, you can see some of the other layers of data that we are overlaying onto that analysis. This shows now truck parking throughout the state. And then if you give it another click, you'll see from there how we're starting to map out exactly where we should invest over time. So this kind of overlays the modeled demand for charging throughout the state over certain time periods based on our adoption scenario that we've incorporated. So this shows 2028, which you can see is focused on the Denver metro area and the I-25 corridor. And then if you give it another click, you can see how that develops over time into 2032 as that expands throughout the state as we're thinking about our investment strategy. And then if you give it one more click, you can see then how that also expands into 2035 and beyond. And then with that, I think my next slide is the last one. We are excited that this summer we're going to be releasing that analysis, and we're going to be launching a new program for charging hub incentives through our Fleet Zero grant program, as well as a new medium and heavy duty corridor lane of the Fleet Zero grant program, specifically targeting shared electric truck charging along major corridors and freight centers. And I have included my contact info here as well if you're interested in reaching out, as well as a QR code if you want to keep updated on that effort where you can sign up. So with that, I will close out and appreciate the time.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Matt. It's clear you all are a leader and evidence of why, based on the extent of work that you all are doing, and really look forward to that report this summer. So now we're going to transition and have a brief panel discussion with the full group here. So first, a question for you, JV. As you mentioned and highlighted in the report, Nevoya won the pilot procurement RFP for the Center for Green Market Activation last year. Can you expand on this pilot project and how aggregating shipper demand using the book and claim system, for example, can create the conditions needed for companies like Greenlane to invest in charging infrastructure?
Yep, I can be quick with this as well. So I think at a high level, book and claim as a tool decouples the physical movement of the goods from its environmental benefits. So it enables a shipper to purchase these verified environmental attributes from miles driven elsewhere in the network. Practically speaking, what that means is that we're able to move freight for customers that quote unquote don't care about emissions and separately sell those credits to those who do. And so the way to perceive this is that it's both an operational and financial innovation. It's financial in the sense of we have these bankable, long-term, multi-year offtake agreement contracts that let us enter markets, establishing infrastructure where it makes sense to do so. So working with Greenlane in this example to think through, like, what do we need to commit to over the next 4 years, 5 years for these offtake agreements in order to be serving the market in this example in Texas. But it's also a really interesting component of being like an operational flexibility, which is to say that you can kind of sell the scale of these credits with companies who are very much aligned to driving that decarbonization agenda. But then we can actually have the flexibility in where we deploy the asset to make sure we're deploying it where it makes most sense to profitably do so. So where does that charging infrastructure need to live? Where can we extract the highest utilization rates? Where is the cost of energy cheaper versus the market? And where do we see the best backhaul opportunities? So we see it as like operational and financial innovation that lets us deploy a large number of trucks into those markets.
Makes a lot of sense. Thanks for sharing that. So I'm going to move over a question for you, Matthew. Recently announced that you all will be moving into Texas. Obviously, it's a lot different policy environment than California. Can you talk about what gave Greenlane the confidence to invest in that corridor, and what factors from policy to incentives do you believe are the most critical in making the business case for medium and heavy duty electrification and charging infrastructure in markets like Texas?
Yeah, no doubt that Texas is a different policy landscape than California, where we've been operating so far. But there are definitely kind of market signals that we're seeing. The Nevoya GMA thing is a great start, and then we're kind of able to look at the other factors in Texas that can help us do business. Right, we're looking at utility rates, we're looking at freight volumes, we're looking at the ability for us to install things like DERs. I talked about that a little bit in the chat. So policy incentives and cash for chargers is great, and those are the kinds of things that we'll continue to work on from a policy landscape in Texas. But in the immediate, we still find it to be very investable just based on market signals and where there will be freight and the important work that's being done bring customers like Navoya there through GMA. So it is a lot of factors, and it's hard to kind of answer that question with one thing, but I think we can look at the entire picture of Texas and see that it's still very investable. I think that the takeaway from this is that our industry is able to stand on its own 2 feet already. We don't need incentives to be able to build, but what those do help us do is grow a lot further, a lot faster. And so we want to continue to build those where we can. But at the same time, we're really excited to go to Texas just based on what we see there now.
Great. That's exciting to hear. So Eric, I have a question for you. Looking ahead, how do you see the role and internal processes of utilities like PG&E evolving to more proactively enable transportation electrification, particularly in the freight sector, where the power demand for individual sites is typically a lot larger than what is needed for passenger vehicles?
Thanks, Ann. So that's a pretty loaded question, a lot in there. Don't have a lot of time. Maybe I'll try to touch on some of the less wonky stuff as the grid planning gets into the weeds really quickly, but some of the more kind of tangible stuff that fleets and customers might care about. So we're significantly scaling up our EV advisory services offerings. And that really acts as a free consultant and a single point of contact or a concierge of sorts for working through our processes and related processes for commercial customers, getting energized and the rest, and working through our different incentive programs. Second, we're also improving and adding functionality to our GRIP portal, which is it provides load capacity maps throughout our service territory, and that allows customers to kind of better see where capacity is without submitting a service application. And we're also scaling our capacity bridging solutions. That includes Flex Connect featured in the report. And also we're also piloting front-of-the-meter DERs, such as that act as a capacity bridge, and significantly improving our energization timelines through the broader process improvements. Better tools, including customer-facing tools, so folks can kind of see where they are in the process, and just more collaborative customer communication and transparency with respect to that. I'll pause there, but there's a lot more going on the planning side with respect to kind of extending our forecasting horizon to better kind of get in front of those long lead investments that can act as delays.
Great. Thanks, Eric. So to close us out on our questions, Matt, wanted to better understand, how do you all coordinate with other state agencies on the implementation of projects, and any lessons learned that you would share with others in that, cross-agency coordination?
Yeah, and I know we're running out of time on our side. We just had kind of a quick question to send to each panelist. So happy to share more for anyone who's interested, and especially from the state side of the equation, from a coordination perspective. But we work really closely, particularly with our DOT as well as our Department of Public Health and Environment. As I mentioned, we do have incentives that are available for both infrastructure and for vehicles, kind of similar in California, right? You have HVIP that's run by one agency and then energized by another agency. It's similar in Colorado, where we run the charging infrastructure incentive programs at the energy office, and then we also get funding for infrastructure to support, like for instance, NEVI funding that has flowed through our DOT, as well as then the vehicle incentives that are offered through our Department of Public Health and Environment. So it's really important that we're, in touch. We have ongoing coordination meetings. We make sure that, funding can stack, that there's clear consistency and certainty for industry and for other stakeholders.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I know we had a ton more questions. I think we were able to answer some of them in the chat. And but we thank all of you for your participation today. Great engagement, great information. Thank you to all of you who have participated. Just want to wrap up real quick and alert you to a couple of other webinars that we have coming up. One will be on June 25th, a Municipal Guide to Sustainable Public EV Charging Rates. And then in September, we'll have a webinar on green bank financing for fleet electrification. So we hope that you can join us all for those webinars as well. If you have any questions coming out of today's session, please don't hesitate to contact any of the speakers or directly with the EC team, and we'll try to help you out as best we can. But thanks so much for staying on and participating in today's webinar. Have a great day.